And as the NATO Secretary General said, this is the largest land grab annexation in Europe since the Second World War. It's a political step, essentially, by President Zelensky. I think he knows that there's no precedent for NATO taking on a new member which is involved in an actual fighting war. But already Ukraine is clearly a very close partner of NATO. We're working very closely with it. And I'm sure NATO can find a process to show that we are increasing the intensity of cooperation. But actual membership, I think, is still some way away until after this war is over.
We spoke earlier on in the programme to Deputy Head of the Ukrainian delegation at NATO, and her argument was, when I suggested that it was unlikely that Ukraine would get this fast-tracked access, was, do you know what, already there is essentially a war between the West and Russia. What difference would it make if Ukraine became a NATO country? In your mind, what difference would it make?
Well, there is a difference. I mean, I can absolutely understand why Ukraine now wants to be a member of NATO as soon as possible. But there is a difference between a country which NATO is supporting, like Ukraine or like Georgia, and actually being a member. As being a member of NATO, then the full Article 5 commitment applies. That is, one for all and all for one. If Ukraine joined NATO, then the whole of NATO would be at war with Russia. That is the honest answer. And NATO allies have not been ready to say, we are at war with Russia. We are certainly supporting Ukraine very strongly, but it's Ukraine fighting the war with Russia. And to suddenly find that Russia was in a war with the United States is significantly different. And I don't think NATO members are going to want to go there.
But does that make Ukraine feel like they're not being fully supported by the West? It's just a partial support that is convenient for them.
It comes back to this point that being a NATO member is a very significant thing. It requires consensus among all the member states. We take on a commitment, which is an absolutely solid legal commitment. NATO is not at war in Ukraine. NATO is supporting a very valiant ally in Ukraine, but there is a different thing. And I think there is a different legal connotation to being a full member of NATO. And yes, it does leave Ukraine feeling vulnerable, but I think they've enjoyed enormously strong support. And countries like the UK and the US have made very clear that we will stand by Ukraine through thick and thin. So I don't think they need to feel abandoned in any way, but I do think that that distinction between being a member and not a member has to be maintained.
Clearly, there has to be a reaction from the international community to the annexation of these 4 territories in Ukraine. What should the international community be doing? Is it about ratcheting up sanctions? Is it about providing more or different weapons?
I think it's both those things. I think it's more weapons, more of the most modern weapons that can really give Ukraine capacity to defend itself well. And ratcheting up sanctions, yes, there's probably not much more scope. I think the really important thing is to make those sanctions that are in place now work well. And that means, in particular, avoiding Russia evading them, getting their hands on Western electronics, for example, that they need to manufacture more weapons for the future. And there is quite a lot of leakage, I think, via places like Dubai and Hong Kong and so on. So I think extending the range of the sanctions in terms of the countries that support them, preventing leakage and Russian attempts to get round them, that is probably the most important priority now.
We spoke to a former speechwriter for President Putin earlier on, albeit now that he speaks out against Vladimir Putin. And he was talking about there is a possibility that the tide could turn in Russia. If people feel that the end is nigh, then they would turn against Vladimir Putin. What are your views when you look at the rantings, the ramblings, the threats from Putin, the protests in Russia? What do you think of where Putin is right now and what the future holds for him?
I mean, I think he is significantly weakened, both on the battlefield and as you know, with these huge protests going on around Russia at the mobilization. And it's not a good thing to be a Russian dictator and to look weak, to look like you've made a massive failure in an initiative that was personally Putin's. So I do think his position is weakened. I think it's very difficult to say from the outside, how close are we to some kind of palace coup or uprising in Russia? I mean, if we knew about it, then Putin would have known about it before and would have done something to stop it. So I can't say how long it's going to take now, but it feels to me like this is such a massive error by Putin that we are now somehow in the end game of the Putin regime. Who knows how long it will take, but he's not the same Putin he was 5 years ago.